Good afternoon, everyone. Good Chodesh. We're continuing one last week, Bezrat Hashem, with a remote that is a video of the Zera Shimshon. In order that we don't continue it, we don't break our consistency, but because it's still Chanukah tomorrow night, and there's still people with spending time with their family and on vacation and everything else. We want to make sure that we still record something. However, we want to allow everyone to do it without having to feel that there's a conflict and there's any reason to not spend the time with the family during this wonderful holiday time, holiday season, holiday time that is a chag. And today, of course, is Rosh Chodesh Tevet. So we're going to be starting as well as that. This is hopefully should be a great time for us in terms of our learning, in terms of beginning to start seeing the light both in terms of Chanukah and also in terms of just everything overall. We continue to daven that the tefillot of the Zera Shimshon come true for all of those who are listening, whether it's with refuah, Yeshua, and everything else that they need. Continue to find bracha and atzlacha and everything that we do. In this week's parsha, which is at the end of last week's parsha, we have the cliffhanger where Yosef says that challenges everyone, all the shvatim, to bring down Binyamin, and then Yosef puts his goblet into the bag of Binyamin's bag and says that the person who has my cup, he will become an eved for me forever. And of course, the story unfolds that we know that it's Binyamin. And now we're at the cliffhanger. The end of last week's parsha is the cliffhanger is now what happens. So at the beginning of this week's parsha, we know that Yehuda comes and speaks an emotional speech to Yosef, and it challenges him and says that this is not what we wanted to do. This is not what meant to happen, etc., etc. And towards the end of this week's parsha, we have a wonderful, unique idea that most of us overlook because we kind of take it for granted, but there is a good question, and the Zera Shimshon asks a question that we're going to get to in a second. As we get to the second, third, and fourth Aliyot, we already start seeing that at the second Aliyah, Yosef already reveals himself to his brothers and says, "Don't worry, everything is from Hashem." And he says, "This is everything that happened from the moment that I left at the age of 17 to the time now, which I'm around 39, and everything that happened, the ups and downs, everything is from Hashem." He says that very clearly in the Psukim. And then we have this where Yaakov starts, and then the third Aliyah is where the brothers come back to Yaakov and say that his son Yosef is still alive. So that already is beginning to, we start seeing the beginning of the reality, the new reality, that this acceptance of what's going on. And then we have we have the famous point of where they meet together, where in the Aliyah of Chamishi is where we have the moment where Yosef and Yaakov meet up. And it's obviously an emotional meeting. It's an emotional meeting. It's charged with lots of feelings on both sides and what's going on. And Yosef was obviously Yaakov's favorite son. They're out of communication for 22 years, except for this very little communication between the brothers, and Yaakov doesn't know it's it's actually his son, etc. And then, we have nothing. We have really no relationship, and they basically, Yaakov kind of almost admits, but he doesn't really say that. He kind of says, an animal attacked him. Yaakov comes down to Mitzrayim, and the Torah explains this wonderful experience, and this is kind of a lesson for us of how do we respond when something like this happens. Now, obviously, we hope that nothing like this should ever happen, but we know that in this time these days, we do have something like this. What is that first moment going to be like? What is that first moment going to be when someone has this moment where they haven't seen someone for many, many years? They haven't seen someone, even with social media, even with all the various abilities to communicate. What happens? What's that moment like? And so the Torah explains. It says, "Vayasor Yosef merkavto." Yosef undoes his chariot. Vayal likrat Yisrael. Aviv Goshna Vayera Elav Vayipol Tzavarav Vayevkav Tzavarav Al Tzavarav Od. This is in Perek Memvav Pasuk Kaftet. Excuse me. Yosef undoes his chariot. Yosef boards his chariot, gets on his chariot, rides up to Yaakov to Goshen, He's Vayira Elav. He sees him. He falls on his neck. He cries, and Vayav got Savarab. He falls on his neck, and then he cries on his neck, and more. So the pasuk is describing to us that moment that Yosef cries, as he cries on his father's shoulders, and he says, but it doesn't tell us that Yaakov cried, right? And why not? And Yosef and the famous Rashi that we all know, we all grew up to learn that that Yaakov was busy reading Kriyat Shema. This is Torah. Excuse me. Torah Yud in the Zera Shimshon, the 10th Torah. Question is, what's going on here? Yosef is crying and Yaakov doesn't cry. He's busy reading Kriyat Shema. That's the question, really. And he says, the Zera Shimshon starts his Torah by saying, it's a short one, but it's a very emotional one and filled with a great lesson for all of us. It says, Pasuk, it says, Vayira elav ipolat tzavarav, Pirash Rashi, Aval Yaakov lo nafal tzavar Yosef, meaning, Lo neshako, Lefisha Yaakov Shema, meaning that Yaakov was busy falling, Yaakov was busy, and so he couldn't cry, and he couldn't kiss him because he was busy reading Kriyat Shema. Machshima Olam, he quotes the Gur Aryeh, which is the Maharalmi Prague. Many other people also mention it. The Siftei Chachamim mentions it. But the Maharalmi Prague is an excellent answer, and I'm going to go through the Maharalmi Prague quickly just because I think it offers a little bit of insight in comparison to what the Zera Shimshon says. The Maharalmi Prague asks, he says, why would... If it was really the time, the Maharal is asking, if it was time to read Kriyat Shema, then Yaakov should have been, Yosef should have also been saying Kriyat Shema, right? If it was really the case, right? And it's also, if you look at the words of the pasuk, it says that Yaakov saw Yosef, right? The word, the pasuk, Vayera Elav, meaning that they saw each other, right? Only after he saw him did he start reading Kriyat Shema. So therefore, what? What do we learn from that? That because the Zman Kriyat Shema, because at the time, at the reading, what do we do when we say Kriyat Shema? We cover our eyes, right? And therefore, he saw him first before he actually read Kriyat Shema, right? Because in other words, for him to see it, because when I'm saying Kriyat Shema, I'm covering my eyes. So if I'm covering my eyes, then I can't really say it because that means I couldn't see him. So that means that what caused Yaakov to see when he saw Yosef to read Kriyat Shema? Right, so that's the question. The question is, what is this moment of? We have this moment of 22 years of emptiness in between, and what you say is, what happens? The first thing he does is he covers his eyes, or he sees him, and then he covers his eyes, and that's the question of the Maharal, and the Zera Shimshon is asking the same exact question. He's going to offer his own spin on it, but in order to provide context, I'm going to offer the insight of the Maharal first. The Maharal says that when Yaakov Avinu saw Yosef as a king of Mitzrayim, and he has this moment of absolute joy and pleasure, right? In other words, he had a moment of saying is Lahodot LaHashem, right? Al Nisecha Shebechol Yom Imanu, like just like we say in Chanukah. It's very related to Chanukah, and it's no coincidence that the story of Chanukah almost always falls out with either close to or on Parshat Vayigash. The point of the story is that look what happened. Yaakov originally said, "Oh, my son was killed, or he was attacked, and he didn't understand what was going on for 22 years. He had no understanding what's going on. Why Yosef didn't communicate with him is another question. The Or HaChaim has a wonderful answer, but we won't get into that. The Maharal says, he says that when his son was taken, when he was still 17, so a young kid. And we know that the Rashi there already mentions that he's still doing things that young kids do, right? Whether he's playing with his hair, whatever it is. And he says, look what happens. From the moment he was 17 till the time now, which is 22 years later, 39 years, or 22 now he's 39 years old, with all the challenges, with all the tribulations and all the trials that Yosef had, what happened? He still remained in Kedusha and Tahara. He still remained a person that Yaakov Avinu was impressed to see. Not only that, which would have been enough, right? That's enough. Just that we can't even say how many nisim, but he says, look, all the nisim, and he says beyond that, look, Hashem protected him, and not only did he protect him, he elevated him to greatness. So that's already a reason. And so therefore it said, he took that moment and he said, this is the moment. And that's what Yaakov did. He said, this moment I want to cherish forever. And the moment I say, I'm going to say Shema Yisrael. The moment I say Shema Yisrael, we look at Shema Yisrael, we say is, we're kind of accepting Ol Malchut Shemayim. But another way to approach it is to look at Shema Yisrael and say is, it's recognizing Hashem's greatness and oneness, and kind of looking at the entire, now we look back, and now Yaakov Avinu is looking back at 22 years and saying is, wait, just flashed by my eyes like, quickly, even though it was very painful for me during that whole time. And now all of a sudden, everything makes sense. And so Yaakov Avinu takes that moment, he sees Yosef, and he says, okay, I want to hug you and kiss you. Of course, that probably happened right after he finished saying Shema. But that's not the Torah is going to say here. The Torah is saying is, look, I'm accepting the fact, and I'm accepting Hashem's greatness and Hashem's oneness and Hashem's nisim and niflaot, because look what just happened. Hashem protected Yosef, raised him to greatness, elevated to greatness, and he understood what was going on. And therefore, if we look at the opposite side, and this the Maharal doesn't bring it, but it makes sense to say it this way as well. If we look at Lo Aleinu, right, we look at the Gemara in Brachot, in Daf Samech Aleph Amud Bet, we see what happens with Rabbi Akiva, the famous story with Rabbi Akiva as one of the Asara Arugei Malchut, which, of course, makes sense to talk about it here, because we know that on Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur, we mentioned Asara Arugei Malchut, who were a kapara. The whole point of the Asara Arugei Malchut were the kapara for the Shvatim that sold Yosef. So we look at that, what happened with Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was so busy, the moment he was about to get killed, murdered by the enemy, and he says that he was busy with Kriyat Shema. And of course, right, the same thing that Yaakov Avinu was busy with when he's meeting Yosef. And look, what do the students, Rabbi Akiva's students say? This is what you're busy with. He says, you're busy with at the most difficult time, and the hardest time, and the most challenging time. This is what you're busy with, right? That's what we're going to learn. And Rabbi Akiva offers a wonderful answer. He says, my entire life, I was waiting for the one moment where I can actually accept or fulfill the mitzvah of b'chol nafshecha, b'chol meodecha, right? B'chol nafshecha, meaning with my entire nefesh. Right, here's the moment where I can say Shema Yisrael and accept Hashem's yichud, accept Hashem's wondrous outcome. Even though I have no idea what's going on. Right, I mean, I can't accept. I don't understand everything. But here, at this moment of in case of Yaakov and Yosef, it's a moment of joy, great joy, pure joy, for seeing each other after 22 years. And this moment with Rabbi Akiva, it's a moment of obviously challenging. He realized what is happening, but he also says it's an opportunity for us to recognize Hashem's wondrous creations. And he says, I'm waiting for it, right? This is the moment of trial and tribulation. He still says, this is a moment that you could say, God, this is really what's going on. No, he didn't say that. He didn't get confused. He didn't, at any moment did Rabbi Akiva say for 1 second, and he hesitated. He said, this is a moment for me to be able to do Yehudo Shel Olam, right? And this is, and the Maharal at the end of this piece, which makes sense, at the end of this piece on this pasuk, it says, Zenachon Lamavin, it means accepting yourself. It says, Zenachon Lamavin means that those people we really understand that even in moments of trial and tribulation, we really have to accept Hashem's ways and Hashem's decree at all moments. Now, that's what we're gonna. That's the. So that's the beginning. That's the Maharal, and now we're going to go kind of saying is let's go back to the Zera Shimshon. Now he says his question is V'od kasher the mishpat b'katuv nerash Yaakov ra'at Yosef. Right, we asked the question already. He saw it. V'imal karchach lomar shemiyad Yaakov ra'oto itchil likrot shema v'zetama. Right, so he says now the Zera Shimshon. We said how could we? Why should Yaakov begin to say Kriyat Shema at the moment of Yosef's arrival? Right, before even greeting him. V'gam ein lomar sheYaakov nasai navra'oto b'emser Kriyat Shema. It wouldn't be possible to say that Yaakov, in the middle of reading Kriyat Shema, he raises on distracted. Right, we should all be so lucky to even say that we're not distracted or move our eyes from saying Kriyat Shema. Right, so it wouldn't have been that Yosef certainly Yaakov would not have noticed Yosef. Right, the fact is that the pasuk indicates that Yaakov noticed Yosef, and therefore he not begun to say Kriyat Shema. Meaning, why did Yaakov start to say Shema? It still remains the question. So the Zera Shimshon, the Maharal, we kind of said it's that moment of joy. It's that moment of pure jubilation of what that Yaakov felt, and that's definitely. And I think the way I read the Zera Shimshon, it seems to me that the Zera Shimshon kind of is moving in that direction. He offering a different spin, but he definitely follows the similar idea. And he says, "V'yuvani," this is based on al pi Kabbalah, al pi some certain kavanot of the Ari. So I'm not going to go into every detail of it, but I'm going to kind of go through it and kind of understand it, and or kind of explain as much as best as possible. And maybe that will help us understand a little bit more, and also understand some of the things that we kind of learned when we were growing up. So we'll see. So it says, "V'yuvan b'masha katuva mikubalim." The mikubalim, right? It's in the kavanot of the Ari. It says that when you say Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, we know that the letter Ayin and the letter Daled are big. That's what it says in the Torah, and we also know it's just one of those things that we grew up. And what do we know? We always say that the Ayin and the Daled are Eid. It's a testimony. It's a witness. It's a testimony for us to accept Hashem's greatness. If we look, the kavanot of the Ari actually say, and this is something that the Zera Shimshon says. It says if we take out the word Ayin and Dalet from Shema, the Ayin from Shema and the Dalet from Echad, then we have the letters Shin, Mem, Ayin, Chet. What does that equal? Esmach. He says, Hemotiot Esmach. The four letters that are remaining after the Dalet and Ayin, which are two big letters, Otiot Rabati, they're big letters, right? We look. It says, I will rejoice. I will be happy. So now that already starts sounding similar to what the Maharal said is, I will rejoice from the aid that I'm testifying to the fact that I'm rejoicing at this very moment. All right, and then look what he says here. Daled Rabati Romez Arba'im Hot. The Daled, the large Daled, reminds us of the same. It reminds us of the Imahot, the Ayin Rabati, and the large Ayin. He says from Shema reminds us of the three Avot, right? And the Avraham is Chesed, which is Ayin Gzarim Shel Chesed, corresponding to because Ayin. We also says that the Ayin. How does Ayin correspond to the the Avot? So he says Ayin represents Chesed, and when Avraham is Chesed, we know that, right? Because Ayin Gzarim Shel Chesed, there's 70 bridges of kindness that exist. What does that actually mean? It means that there are 70 ways, really, if you think about it this way. There's 70 ways to do chesed. It could be with your money, it could be with your time, it could be with your food, it could be different ways to do chesed. It means things that you don't have, people, something for you that may not be such a big deal, but someone else says, wow, that's amazing. You can lend someone something. It's all these different angles of chesed. Then he says, Yitzchak din. Yitzchak, we know, personifies justice, right? We know din. Ayin Sanhedrin. How do we know that? Because there's 70 Sanhedrin. There's 70 people in the Sanhedrin. Why? Because we also know that there were 70 Zikanim, right? There were 70 Zikanim in the time of Moshe, and Yetziat Mitzrayim, right? Yaakov, Ayin Nefesh Yotzei Yericho, and Yaakov also. What do we know? That we said next week in the beginning of this week's part, towards the end of already Chamishi, when Yaakov starts coming down, and they enumerate who comes down with Yosef. We have 70. Right? So we have already every one of the three Avot represents some letter of 70. Now the question you're going to say is, what about Sanhedrin has 71? So I think the reason why we have 71, officially we should have 70. But why do we have 71? 70 Keneged is Kenim. But why do we have 71? Because we can't have an even number, 35 and 35. It's actually in this, we already just started, about 2 weeks ago, we started Masechet Sanhedrin and Daf Yomi, so those people could also understand that the beginning of this week, the beginning of Daf Yomi, Amud Bet and Gimel, we already know why we have to have 71 and not 70. But either way, we have that the number 70 corresponds to Avraham as Chesed, Yitzchak in terms of Gvura or Din, and Yaakov in terms of the 70, that a total number of descendants that come down to him from Mitzrayim. That's the end of the story. That's the end of the pasuk, or the end of the quote from the Arizal. And now it says, "Va'ado tasha'a lo ra'a Yaakov ayin nefesh kulam biyachad." Right? He says, from the moment that Yosef was sold, at the moment that he was 17 until today, Yaakov Avinu didn't see 70 people, didn't see the 70 nefesh, and therefore, what he couldn't say the ayin. He couldn't be that. He wasn't complete. The ayin of Yaakov was not complete yet, and therefore, what? first of all, we may actually, just something that I just came up with right now, is that we may be one of the reasons why Hashem changed his name as Yisrael, because then the ayin of Yaakov is not complete. You could say it's okay, you'll still be okay, right? But now if you look at the ayin, he says now, if he was saying Kriyat Shema, the ayin of Yaakov is now complete. Now he too, he's one of the avot. He too is number 70. Umeatasha ba Yosef etzlo, continues the Zera Shimshon, yachdu kol hashivim. Now that Yosef comes to Yaakov, what happens? All 70 are together. And now what he said, Lachein, miyad sharat Yosef. Now we can understand the pasuk even better. Just like a classic Zera Shimshon, now we can understand the pasuk better. Why? Because if we read the pasuk back again, now what happens with the pasuk? The pasuk says, Vayira elav vayipol tzavarav. He says, he saw him, Yosef appeared to Yaakov, Vayira elav, just like we in the pasuk in Parshat Vayira, it says Vayira elav about Avraham, or Hashem appeared to Avraham. So here too, Vayira elav vayipol tzavarav, right? Yosef appeared to Yaakov and he fell on Yaakov's neck. Yosef falls on Yaakov's neck. So, and then when the question obviously is, why is Yaakov saying Kriyat Shema at that moment? Excuse me. So he says that at that moment, Yaakov realized that the ayin, that the Avram, we understood how we get to ayin. Yitzchak, we understand how we get to ayin. Now Yaakov understand how we can. Now Yaakov's ayin is complete. The ayin, the 70 is complete. Of Shema is complete, and now he can say, I can say Shema too, right? The Dalet was the four mothers. Ayin was corresponding to the three avot, but we didn't have the three avot yet because Yosef wasn't there. Now after 22 years, Yaakov says, now I'm complete, and then he says, now I can say, I can be testify, and I can be happy, right? As Arizal was saying, Ed is the big letters, Ayin Dalet from Shema and Echad, and in between we have the esmach, the happiness, right? So he says, Kidichtiv, Vayira elav, right? Yosef appears to Yaakov, Hitchili Kriyat Shema. That's why he started saying Kriyat Shema. It wasn't that he was saying, I'm not excited and I'm not happy and I don't want to give, I want to give my son, I'm not giving my son a kiss or anything like that or a hug, right? It's rather, you have to look at it from that perspective. He's saying give me a second. Hold on a second here. Let me relish this moment by accepting the fact that Hashem, and let me be joyful in the fact that Hashem brought everything together, right? So Shema Yisrael, instead of saying Shema Yisrael is only the fact that I'm accepting Hashem's malchut, right? Ol malchut shamayim. I'm also saying is Hashem, I accept the wonderful situation in the scenario that just took place. Something to think about. And then the Zera Shimshon continues. He says, in order to complete, right, the whole unity of the letter ayin that was up until now missing, because Yaakov was not complete, because all of his sons and grandchildren and in-laws and whatever else didn't reach the number 70 until Yosef was there. Once he saw Yosef, he said, I got to stop for a second and accept the moment. Similar to what we said with Rabbi Akiva. Also, something to think about that I just noticed is Rabbi Akiva's name also has an ayin in it. So both names of Yaakov and Akiva both have an ayin. I'm sure there are many midrashim about the fact that Akiva and Yaakov, they also have very many similar letters to it. Yaakov and Akiva. Yaakov and Akiva actually have many letters together, so it would make sense that Rabbi Akiva and Yaakov have many stories or situations that are similar to each other, right? But if we look again, what we do notice is that when Yosef arrived and Yaakov sees Yosef, it's that moment of, accept everything. I accept everything, and I see how everything, even though I couldn't understand and couldn't comprehend everything during that big moment of 22 years of uncertainty and thinking that Yosef was either killed or attacked or who knows what, he says he was inspired. That was the key here, is that that Yaakov, by seeing Yosef alive and well, he says, and that he's a king. Not only was he alive and well, but he still remained ben Torah mitzvot, and he was shomer Torah mitzvot, and he still lived to the life that he grew up and that he was raised by. So he says that's the completion of the ayin, the completion of the 70 that Yaakov was missing up until now. And he says, for that, I have to take a moment and relish the moment and not just say, okay, give you a hug and kiss. I'll do that too. But let me first take a moment to say Kriyat Shema. And that is what Rashi was saying. He said he was saying Kriya Shema. It's not just he was saying Kriya Shema and that he didn't want to even give him a kiss or a hug. It's the point is that what do we do in a moment when we're so enthralled and so inspired by what's going on? Do we just take it? Or do we just accept it and move on and just kind of let it fleeting moment? Or do we actually say something and recognize and acknowledge how Hashem's greatness is so important to us that we would be willing to even say, let me take a second step back and say Shema. And say acceptance of Hashem's greatness and say that Hashem, this is awesome. Right? Sometimes in the good and sometimes in the bad. And especially nowadays, just imagine, B'ezrat Hashem, we should see it, but imagine that moment when the father or mother or child or grandchild or whatever it is of one of the hostages, they get back. The hostages come back. And we should see that very soon. And what's that moment going to be like? Right? What do we expect? And when we see a moment when we see our children after not seeing them for a few days, or not seeing them after summer vacation, what's that moment like? So that the second we look at that moment and we say, what is it? Is it a moment of just, okay, great, let's move on. How was your day? Or do we say a second and say, really, do we really appreciate the fact that Hashem gave us, and we see that their greatness, and we see that they grow up, and we see that they elevated themselves? Do we take that moment and say, thank you, Hashem? Do we say Shema? Or do we just say, okay, move on? That's the question here. I think that's what the Zera Shimshon is trying to go through. So we really learn here is we learn the idea that of the Maharal, and he takes it one direction. But I think, and I actually believe that the Maharal's question is the springboard for what the Zera Shimshon is trying to say. Is that the moment that the completion of the ayin, which is where the Zera Shimshon takes it, is really comes from and emerges from the Maharal's question, where the Maharal says is that it's that moment of joy, that moment of inspiration. What happens at that moment of inspiration? He says, it's Yosef, after 22 years, remained a person. Not only that, Hashem elevated him, and now Yaakov can say, oh, I see that Hashem's ways, even though they're challenging at the time, in the moment, in that thick of the bush, we can't see it. We can't see it, right? Mina Meitzar, we can't see that Meitzar in that deep situation where we're really stuck in saying, where is Hashem? All of a sudden we take a step out, and right, Yosef meets, and Yaakov sees Yosef, and all he says, Anani ber merchavi, I understand it, I got it. I understand everything. Everything makes sense to me now. And at that moment when everything makes sense, do you say Shema Yisrael, or you just allow it to move on? Shabbat Shalom, Chanukah Sameach. Look forward to seeing everyone next week.